I'm 49 years old, and I was diagnosed with a hereditary factor 10 deficiency when I was a year old. Through the times, I've had to go to the hospital about 150 times for transfusions of fresh frozen plasma to treat bleeds that were not being controlled by themselves. It's important to me to share my story about hereditary factor 10 deficiency because most of my life there weren't very many stories for me to listen to and hear about. And through time, I've very much wondered about what life was like for somebody else with factor 10 deficiency. And so I would like to take a little bit of time to share some of my thoughts and the things that I've experienced with it. Growing up, I always thought that I wanted to be more normal like the rest of the kids. I can remember being a little kid and having plans to do stuff with friends like go to Great America or go to the boardwalk or any number of fun things to do. And 2 days before, I would fall down and get hurt and have maybe not even a joint bleed, but a deep muscle bleed in my thigh that made it so that it hurt really bad to walk. And so I couldn't go and do that. And then the friend would have to scramble to find somebody else to fill the ticket. And so I felt almost guilty because I would get invited to go and do things and then couldn't go and do them. Sports was another thing that I missed out on a lot. My first year playing t-ball, I was swimming a couple of days before a game and my waterlogged fingers got cut. And I don't know even how I got them cut, but they were two decent cuts on two fingers that wouldn't stop bleeding, and I couldn't play t-ball anymore. Couldn't put a glove on, couldn't grasp anything because I had two fingers that the tips were almost cut off of. And it was things like that cost me a lot of pool time or swimming in the lake or going to the river. And that was pretty hard a lot of the time. As a small child, we refrained from treatment as much as we could because there was a lot of bloodborne diseases going around, like AIDS and hepatitis. So we tried to avoid that. And one of the steps that we did to avoid that was when I would have a bleed in an ankle or a hip, it was just to immobilize it. So I spent a lot of time in elementary school on crutches. The impact of hereditary factor 10 deficiency on my education has been pretty significant. In elementary school, it wasn't as much, but I would still continue to miss school because of bleeds. Lots of times it would be for 4 days in a row, and that would happen 4 or 5 times a school year. When you miss that much, you miss out on a lot of the social stuff too, and people start to realize that you're different and why aren't you there, and you look fine, but you miss a lot of school. And so that was an interesting thing to have to explain, and as well as showing up for school on crutches so many times. But as I got older and school became more demanding, in high school doing college prep courses and missing out on chemistry lab that you can't really make up. In high school, there's just no way to make up lab time a lot of the time. And going to college after high school, that was even more of a challenge because classes are more demanding. There's less sympathy for somebody with a invisible disability that seems like they're okay, and walking to class was a burden. Like I would walk to class and it would be a quarter mile's not that long of a walk, but when you need your hip replaced and your ankle is blown up, it's a long walk. And then showing up to class in pain and trying to focus was a real challenge. And it unfortunately still continued to happen every semester. And it eventually made it so that it was really hard to succeed in school. When I was a little kid, one of the things I remember the most is always having a goose egg on my forehead. And aside from the goose egg, my shins were always bruised up, and my elbows and my forearms were always just tons of small bruises. Nothing really significant, but a lot of small bruises. One time I fell down and busted my lip open. And parents were worried that, because their little kid fell down and hurt his lip, and it's no big deal because little kids do that. And kind of, put a cold rag on it, stopped bleeding. Mom put me down for a nap. And when she came to check on me, she was really scared because my lip had opened up again and the crib was full of blood. So she got, pretty scared and stuff and took me to the hospital because my lip was bleeding still. And they tried to stitch it up and the stitches wouldn't hold because it kept bleeding underneath the stitches. And finally they said, well, we need to run some tests. And at first they were really afraid that I had leukemia. And then through the process of elimination, they were like, no, he doesn't have leukemia, but he's got this other really weird bleeding disorder that we don't really know that much about. And it's called Stewart-Power syndrome. And then through learning and things like that, they eventually figured that it was factor 10 deficiency. But for that incident, they didn't treat it or anything. I just had a big, huge, fat, swollen lip for about 10 days. Spent 3 days in the hospital for that one. That was my first trip. I can remember the first time that I got stitches growing up, and I just went over the handlebars of my bike and landed on my forehead and needed 4 stitches. And it wasn't that big of a deal. And I went to the emergency room and told them, hey, factor 10 deficiency, crashed my bike, need stitches. They stitched me up, sent me home, still with an ice pack and everything. And the interesting thing about when I get stitches is even after the stitches, they continue to ooze quite a bit. And so by the time it was a week later and it was time to get your stitches out, they had to kind of dig them out a little bit. And, no big deal. I went home and everything was fine, but I started to get like a lump underneath my incision or my cut where the cut was. And I got out of the shower one time and it was bleeding pretty bad. And I was like, oh no. Called my mom. She came in and was like, oh wait, it's time to go back to the doctor. I've also had quite a few muscle bleeds, and those are maybe even more common than joint bleeds. But the severe ones, oh boy, are they severe. Even if I would just have a bruise in one spot on my thigh, it would continue to bleed until my entire quadricep would be filled up with blood. And it didn't look as bad as it felt. It looked green and swollen and very warm to touch. But as a result of that large muscle group being hurt, it would make my whole side of my body hurt, my leg hurt. Sometimes it would get so swollen that it actually affected the circulation of my foot. And those those muscle bleeds, were very, very painful. I can remember one muscle bleed in particular, and I think it was the first muscle bleed, really bad one that I had when I had moved away from home and was living on my own. And I was mountain biking with some friends and I crashed. Crashes happen all the time when you're mountain biking. And I landed on the inside of my arm and it hurt. And I was like, ooh, this hurts, but I can be okay. I'll rub some dirt on it and keep riding. Luckily, my buddies were like, no, dude, you took a pretty good spill. Let's go back to the car. So I went back to the car. By the time I got home, I had realized, well, this is probably a good thing that we quit mountain biking and got back to the car. I was resting, I was icing, trying to take care of it on my own, and it got bad. And it hurt super bad and was pressing against nerves and making my hand pins and needly. So I took myself to my doctor, which was a primary care physician, and she looked at me and said, we're just gonna give you some pain pills and send you home. The next day, the bruise was all the way down to the palm of my hand and starting to grow into my fingers. So I went back. Reluctantly, they admitted me to the hospital and they gave me some fresh frozen plasma. And I went home and it slowed it down, but it kept on bleeding. And it kept on bleeding to the point where I had to go in again and get an MRI. And so they gave me a little bit more fresh frozen plasma, sent me home. For a year and a half, I could barely use this arm. Luckily, it's all pretty much better now, except for some lingering pins and needles, but that's what you get. And that was when I was 22 years old. And it's sometimes just from reaching out for something and maybe moving a little bit wrong, having bad body posture. I don't even really know. But sometimes, especially the muscle bleeds, happen for no reason that I could comprehend. And those are challenging and frustrating because you don't really know when it happened or how bad it's going to be, or you don't have the judgment as far as past experiences because you don't know exactly what happened to yourself. One of the tough things about having a hereditary factor 10 deficiency are all of the injuries that just happen as a product of daily life. Just the bottoms of your feet getting bruises on them from stepping on a Lego. You don't really think about that happening. Everybody hates to step on a Lego, but when it actually leaves a bruise on the bottom of your foot, or you have a bruise on your heel from just walking on concrete floor with no shoes on, things like that really start to affect you and make you think about life in a different way. And those are the types of things that just happen having a factor 10 deficiency. That it's not anything that you did wrong or any hazard that you took or put yourself in. It just happens as a way of life. When I would sustain an injury, it was a pretty interesting process a lot of the time, because I would always try and compare myself to other injuries that other people had. And normally you sprain an ankle and it hurts, and then you can see it swell up a little bit and turn a little bit of a color, maybe green, and then in a couple of days it'll get maroon. My ankles, when I would sprain them, they would start off that way, but then it would keep going. And it would keep going to the point where my toes would turn green because there was so much blood in my ankle and my foot that I would have like a green foot and a big, fat, swollen ankle. And unfortunately, it would continue to bleed inside, and so that takes up all the space, and that really hurts the nerves and stuff. Each time I would hurt my ankle, it would become a little bit more fragile. And as a result of having a hurt right ankle, I favored my left leg so much. And over time, my left hip became worse than my right ankle. Growing up with factor 10 deficiency, I'd say that the most common symptom that I had was just joint soreness, because I could go out and play and do stuff, and no matter what, even if I didn't like hurt myself or overdo it or anything, things would just be sore. So I think joint pain, just from walking around and stepping in a gopher hole type things, was the most significant part and symptom of growing up, and probably the greatest inhibitors as far as doing more things. Aside from that, I used to get a lot of bruises, but the bruises weren't as debilitating as the joint bleeds. I've had some bruises on my shoulder that would take up my whole upper arm, and those were uncomfortable, but they were never as bad as the deep joint bleeds. Because those, it would freeze you. It would make it so that if it was in your knee or ankle, it would hurt to move anything around it because all the little things that were attached inside and pulling. And so those joint bleeds, they hurt bad. And they cost me a lot of school days laid up on the couch. When I was 29 years old, I got my left hip replaced. And that was after a long life of many, many hip bleeds. And I don't even remember my first actual hip bleed. I only remember getting off the crutches. And it was in elementary school, I think second grade. And I remember hurting myself and injuring myself, but I don't remember exactly what I did. And then it got hurt again, not that long after. And it was a little bit more of a significant injury to the same spot. So got fresh frozen plasma and was on crutches. I can remember 2 months of being on crutches. And finally the doctor saying, cool, you don't have to use your crutches anymore. And I could go back to pretty much full activity. But when I tried to go back to full activity, that leg did not work. And I came back from that and slowly got back to myself and was fine. And then I hurt it again, and this time I think I was probably 10 or 11, and I got it aspirated because there was enough blood in there that the orthopedist was like, well, we need to get that fluid out because it's impinging on the freedom of the joint. But unfortunately, about 9 months later, I did the same thing, and they tried to drain it again, and for some reason that one hurt 10 times worse and didn't help out at all. When I was 18 years old, senior in high school, and pulling a hand truck up a curb and hurt my hip, and that was the worst that hip had ever been hurt, by far. By the time I got up, woke up in the morning, I could barely stand. Everything hurt, but it was just the way that it was, and the doctors were like, yeah, you're eventually gonna need a new hip, but hold off for as long as you can because you're way too young for a new hip. I always had a limp after that. And as time went on, the limp continued to get worse and worse. It hurt to stand up straight because it hurt to extend my hip that much and have the weight of my leg pulling down on my hip. It hurt to lift my leg up to take a step. So I found myself that I was twisting and throwing my shoulders and my hips to the sides, and it affected my gait quite a bit. And as the time went on and the limp got worse, it was even harder on my knees and my ankles and my back. So for 10 years, my hip hurt. And it bled several more times, and each time it came back, it was worse than it was before. And I went to a couple of orthopedists, and they were like, yeah, you should have this hip done because it's negatively affecting your quality of life in a significant way every day. And I agreed with them. I knew that it was, but it was just kind of a shock to hear a doctor say that I had the hip of a 79-year-old man. And I was only 29, and I was like, wait, I still have a lot of walking and stuff to do in my lifetime. So that was an eye-opener, and it was tough to deal with. But since the insurance company was willing to pay for it, and I needed it really bad, and I was trying to start a new chapter of my life with a new job, I got my hip replaced. And I'm really glad that I did. One time I was just doing some plumbing project out in my yard, and I was laying down on the ground and lifting something really heavy out of a hole, and I thought I hurt my back. And as soon as I got in the emergency room at Stanford, they were like, oh wait, you need to be admitted. And then they did some tests, and they realized that I had a heart sac full of blood, and that it was, making it pretty hard for my heart to beat and for me to get all the oxygen. Over the course of the years, I've had to go to the hospital or the emergency room about 150 times for transfusions of fresh frozen plasma to treat bleeds that were getting out of control. The process that you have to go through to receive the fresh frozen plasma is fairly rigorous. It's at least a 10-hour process, and that's once the needle gets in your arm until they're done administering the medicine. It was always a real hassle for me because by the time I was at the spot where I needed fresh frozen plasma, I was in significant pain. I think it was 2016, on my yearly visit to my hematology treatment center, the doctor said, hey, there's some new medicine that is going to get approved or has been recently approved, and we think that it might be suitable for you. So they gave me some medicine to take home called Coagadex, and they said, keep this for an on-demand emergency use. But I didn't use the Coagadex because I'd never had an emergency compared to some of the other emergency bleeds that I had had that was like, oh, you're gonna definitely keep on going downhill if you don't treat it. So I had Coagadex, and it was kind of like this mysterious thing in my closet. And the time that I needed it, I hurt my ankle, and I called up my doctor, and she said, yeah, come and we'll mix it up for you and give you an IV. And I did, and it was the first time that I had used Coagadex. So I had been approved to use Coagadex on demand to treat bleeds, and I had had a couple and used it. I didn't realize how effective it was until I got on a Facebook group, a Factor 10 deficiency Facebook group, and one of the administrator for the group is a mother who has two children that also have severe Factor 10 deficiencies. And she was adamant that I should talk to my doctors about using Coagadex prophylactically. I went for my yearly checkup and talked to my hematologist, and she immediately agreed with me for all the reasons that I gave her. I learned how to self-infuse, and twice a week ever since then, I've been on Coagadex. The daily pain is decreased significantly. I feel like I can exert myself more and not pay the price for it afterwards. Since beginning prophylactic therapy, I've noticed a huge difference in my body. As a result of finding other patients that were using Coagadex as their factor replacement prophylactically, that gave me the courage and the knowledge to go to my healthcare professional and tell them what I'd learned through other patients and learned on my own and learned through the website. I've been on Coagadex for about 18 months. I bought a mini bike just to put around the neighborhood. I have some little trails around my house and a nice private road to ride on, and it's great. And I look forward to when the drought's over, and I look forward to the next camp trip when I take the mini bike and can go putt around the lake. Because that's another thing that I love to do, is go off into the woods and go camping. Just me and my dog and my 4Runner. Using Factor 10 prophylactically helps me on a daily basis. Everything that I used to do was associated with some pain, whether it was strained muscles or minor pulls or just overusing a muscle group. There have been several times when I've been out in the yard doing something, pushing a wheelbarrow for example, and slipping and feeling that little muscle pull in your hip and thinking to myself, wow, this could be really bad. And then reminding myself that, wait a second, but I'm on Coagadex, and now it's great. I love riding bikes. I mean, I grew up in a small town where it was like, get on your bike and go. And I used to always have a bicycle-related injury. And now I still like to pedal around and stuff, but it's just so nice that when you do accidentally kick the pedal with your shin, it's not the end of the world. Little things like that, like fishing and getting stuck with a fishing hook. And now pull the fishing hook, luckily, never too bad, but you pull the fishing hook out and it stops bleeding after a while, and you don't get that super duper sore fingertip from having a bruise in your fingertip from having it stabbed. That it's just a little sore, and it's not the end of the day. I can keep going and keep having fun. I talked to my doctors and I learned how to self-infuse. Twice a week on Wednesdays and Saturdays, I infuse Factor 10 prophylactically. So when I started to do it myself, sure, it was intimidating, but it's just something that you get used to, and luckily for me, it hasn't been too much of a challenge. One of the unique challenges of having a Factor 10 deficiency is finding anybody else that has a Factor 10 deficiency, because we're kind of a rare group and it's hard to find information about other patients. And my whole life, I was always super curious about what's it like for somebody else to have Factor 10 deficiency. When social media started to take off and become more popular, I was like, well, I should give this another shot and look into it and see if I can track down another person or a family that's experienced or knows anything about Factor 10. And luckily I did. And I was very pleasantly surprised how good it felt to talk to another person that was in a similar situation with me, and how good it felt to hear their stories and some of the things that they had gone through, and that it made me feel not nearly as alone and not nearly as isolated or on an island, and that there are other people, and that there will continue to be other people like me that have a Factor 10 deficiency that need a resource to go to, that need some information that they can find, and maybe a friend to talk to. And that's a valuable thing. And everybody deals with their challenges differently, but it's still a challenge, and sometimes it's nice to have a little bit of help with somebody who's been through the same type of thing. One nice resource that was introduced to me as a patient using Coagadex was the Power of 10 program. And that was a really, really nice surprise. I was very happy when the nurse called and we had a conversation just about life and having a Factor 10 deficiency and what her thoughts were and what she had learned from other patients and what she was learning from me and what she had to share from other patients' knowledge that I didn't know. And it also helped me out to learn a lot more about Coagadex and the other community members that have bleeding disorders, because she had a lot of information that I didn't know. And it is and continues to be one of the phone calls that I look forward to every month. And it's a really good program. The professionals that they have that I've spoken with have always been very endearing, very open, super receptive. I think since we're all human beings. Community is important, and it's good to be around other people in the community, and it's good to be around, all sorts of different people. It's also really nice to be around people that you have similarities with. If I had an opportunity to speak with somebody else that has a hereditary factor 10 deficiency, a friend of theirs or a caregiver or a relative, I would definitely suggest to them to advocate for yourself. Become educated about the condition, the available options, and definitely talk to your doctor. And I am so pleased that I talked to my doctor about Coagadex and using that as a factor replacement and using it prophylactically instead of just on demand. So I would definitely say Coagadex is a great solution for me and my factor 10 deficiency. If I could say anything to a physician that had a patient with factor 10 deficiency, it would be listen, but also try and help them out with some Coagadex, because there's not a lot of options out there to treat factor 10 deficiency. I would like to see the doctors considering it more, because sometimes the patient has to go out and look for alternatives and solutions, and it can be hard to present those to the doctor. And with all that in mind, I would hope that anybody else that has a factor 10 deficiency could learn and hopefully not have to go through some of the trials and tribulations that other people have had, and use some of this knowledge and some of this information to talk to their doctors, or to have the doctors watch these videos and see what's going on with the patients and realize how much of a benefit this type of medicine is. I look forward to going out and doing more things and being able to have the tool of Coagadex to help me out. And now that I have Coagadex, I think more about long-term career goals. Even though I'm 50, I still have a lot of years left in me, and how much more productive I could be in that area because of the confidence that I have, not only not injuring myself or having a bleed, a spontaneous bleed, or an accident that's not my fault. Now that I'm on Coagadex, I feel more confident that if one of those accidents were to happen, that I would be okay because my factor levels are high. And with that opens up the opportunity to go more places and do more things and be further away from home, because it's easy to transport and take with.